This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Yesterday, Nigel Farage launched the Reform Party's Manifesto in Wales, where he attacked both the devolved Labour government for its questionable record on public services and the Conservatives for failing to act as an effective opposition. At the launch, Farage refused to call it a manifesto, instead declaring it a contract with the people, apparently because when people hear manifesto, they think lie, and said he wanted to use this election to establish that bridgehead in Parliament before challenging for Prime Minister in 2029. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Reform's manifesto and ask whether it could catapult Farage into number 10 by the end of the decade. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with Reform's immigration policy, because that's both the policy area that the media and Reform themselves have focused on most. It's worth splitting Reform's migration policy into a regular migration policy and an asylum or refugee policy. In both cases, Reform basically think the UK is letting in way too many people. When it comes to regular migration, which accounts for the vast majority of immigration into the UK, Reform want to immediately freeze what they describe as non-essential immigration, which apparently means all immigration apart from healthcare workers, and ban visas for international student dependents. Reform also wants to completely abolish the Home Office and replace it with a new Department for Immigration. In the aggregate, Reform hope these measures will bring net immigration down to zero. When it comes to asylum seekers, Reform's immediate priority here would be to, quote, stop the boats. For context, for the past few years, growing numbers of asylum seekers have been arriving in the UK by crossing the Channel from France in small boats. While the number of people arriving in small boats fell between 2022 and 2023, more people have arrived so far this year than ever before. Farage has been railing against the small boats since they started arriving in 2020, but it's become an increasingly salient issue over the past few years, as the numbers have grown and successive Conservative policies, including most recently the controversial Rwanda plan, have failed to deal with it. Anyway, in order to stop the boats, Reform would implement a policy that would basically ban anyone arriving in a boat from resettling in the UK, and instead either deport them to offshore processing in countries like Rwanda or send them back to France. This would probably be a violation of the UK's obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights, but this isn't a problem for Reform, because they also want to leave the ECHR. For context, the ECHR is a supranational court, separate to the EU and the ECJ, formed in the aftermath of World War II, to protect human rights and political freedoms in Europe. Every European country except Russia and Belarus are parties to the convention, although it's worth saying that their rulings have come under increasing pressure recently, and last year France ignored an ECHR ruling to repatriate an Uzbek Islamist. Perhaps the second most interesting bit of the Reform manifesto are the proposed constitutional reforms. Reform want to ditch first past the post in favour of a proportional electoral system, ditch postal voting, reform the House of Lords, and replace the Human Rights Act with a new British Bill of Rights. When it comes to public services, Reform want to increase NHS spending to cut waiting lists down to zero within 2 years, including by giving those on waiting lists vouchers for private treatment. Reform would also end the cap on university places for medical students, write off medical student debt over the next decade, and allow all frontline NHS and social care staff to pay less tax for the next 3 years. They also want to introduce a tax relief for private healthcare providers to encourage other people to use private healthcare and reduce the strain on the NHS, as well as a new national plan for social care to be worked out by a royal commission. Reform also wants another 40,000 police officers on the streets, stricter sentences for drug-related crime, automatic life imprisonment for violent offenders, and another £2 billion for the justice system. In his public speeches, Farage has also suggested emulating the tough-on-crime strategy successfully pursued by Rudy Giuliani during his tenure as mayor of New York in the 90s. Reform also wants to massively increase agriculture and fishing subsidies and ban foreign trawlers from fishing in British waters, while increasing defence spending from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP by 2030. On top of this new spending, Reform also wants to massively cut taxes. Reforms say they would lift the personal allowance threshold from about £12,500 to £20,000, lift the higher rate of income tax from about £50,000 to £70,000, scrap VAT on energy bills, abolish inheritance tax for estates under £2 million, lower fuel duty by 40%, massively reduce stamp duty, cut corporation tax from 25% to 15% by 2029, and bring in a 20% tax relief on private school fees. More generally, Reform want to massively simplify both the UK's planning and tax systems. So, given Reform simultaneously wants to cut taxes and increase spending, how do they plan on paying for all of this? Well, first they want to scrap net zero targets, which they say would save £30 billion a year, although this figure is obviously very much disputed. Instead, Reform wants to invest both in North Sea oil and gas and nuclear power. Reform also wants to massively cut back on welfare spending by cutting welfare for anyone who doesn't get a job in 4 months or refuses 2 job offers, and denying any benefits to those who haven't lived and worked in the UK for at least 5 years. Reform also wants to scrap HS2, which they say would save roughly £25 billion, and introduce an employer immigration tax that would force companies to pay a higher 20% rate of national insurance for foreign workers, up from the 13.8% which would remain for British-born workers. True to form, Reform also claimed that they would save money by cutting the remaining Brexit red tape, cracking down on tax evasion, and cutting foreign aid by another 50%. Reform also claimed that they could find another £50 billion in savings just by cutting down on government waste and the civil service, although we should say that this sounds pretty implausible. Perhaps most interestingly though, Reform wants to stop paying out the £40 billion that the Bank of England currently pays as interest to its commercial banks, holding its quantitative easing reserves. This is a technical point that we discussed in more detail in this video, but the TLDR is that the Treasury currently pays the Bank of England something like £40 billion a year to compensate it for its losses on the gilt purchases. Again, this is pretty complicated, but it's worth saying that neither Europe nor the US does this, because, well, central banks can't really go bust. So those are Reform's policies, undeniably radical, but fiscally questionable. Let us know what you think in the comments down below. A week or so ago, we announced that we're working on a physical magazine which dives deep into the upcoming UK general election. But it turns out that designing a magazine isn't all that easy. So we headed to Skillshare to take a look through some of their design courses. Unlike when we tried to learn InDesign for another, never-released project a few years ago, we were guided through the process quickly and efficiently. And this time, the project will actually see the light of day thanks to Skillshare's incredibly easy-to-follow guides. It's not just that either. You likely already know that Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts from across film, illustration, design, freelance, and productivity. But Skillshare can also help you take your career or side hustles to the next level, with hundreds of career-focused classes. That's courses on everything from how to start a business to maximizing your workflow, or how to grow in e-commerce. Another course we used when building the website for the magazine. The best news is that the first 500 people to use the link in the description will receive 1 month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today.